Welcome to our Pastor's Bible Study today. I hope y'all are doing well, and want to welcome those of you that are in this room sharing the meal together. Welcome those of you that are online. We're glad you're able to join us today as we continue our study of the book of Exodus. And today we are in Exodus 4, and you should have an outline available for you. They're over here by Cheryl if you didn't get one. And I think we have them for you also online. Today we're going to talk about the fact that Moses finally returns to Egypt. And somewhat of an interesting story today. So we left Moses last week in Midian. He let his father-in-law know that he was headed to Egypt. And so that's where we pick up the story today. So let's look at chapter 4, verse 19, where the text says, "Now the Lord had said to Moses in Midian, 'Go back to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead.' So Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and started back to Egypt, and he took the staff of God in his hand." So this is where the story begins now, as he's going to make this journey to Egypt. Of course, the imagery of a man of God with his wife and family on a donkey going to Egypt. There's a lot. That's just kind of something we'll read about again, won't we? When the Holy Family will do that at some point. And it's a long journey depending on where you believe Moses was. It was several days for him to get there, particularly depending upon how the travel was going to go with his wife and evidently his two sons at this point. Excuse me, you'll notice he took the staff with him as God told him. Make sure you take that staff with you. Aaron also is going to be connected to this staff of God, and the Lord is going to use it powerfully in Egypt. And then you come to verses 21 and 23, and I just refer to that as Exodus in summary, because here's basically what is about to unfold in front of them. So the Lord said to Moses, "When you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I've given you the power to do. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then say to Pharaoh, 'This is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go so he may worship me. But you refused to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son.'" Well, that's kind of a summary of what's about to unfold in front of Moses. I don't know that Moses knew all of that just yet up to this point, particularly the part about how the last plague was going to take place. But here are the insights, as I've listed for you in your outline, as to how God is going to do this once he departs Midian. First of all, the core message is, and the core mission is, God's going to deliver his people. And that is going to be a huge message for the Israelites, as I've shared with y'all before. Because of that, this is going to become the story in the Old Testament. When you study Old Testament theology, when you look at how the Jews viewed their relationship with God, this is the creation, obviously, is the beginning, the call of Abraham, but the story of Exodus is the major theological redemptive story in the Old Testament. And there's no way to exaggerate its impact in the lives of Jewish theologians. This story is going to be told over and over and over and over and over. It'll be repeated in the Psalms. The message will be communicated in the synagogues once those are put into place in the New Testament era. Jesus will be very familiar with this story. Men like Stephen are familiar with this story. I mean, this becomes the story of God's hand of deliverance. And it kind of captures Israel's hopes in every era of their life. It still is one of the stories that Israel tells. And with the long winding journey that Israel has been on through the years and all the challenges that this nation has faced through the years, this is still the story that to them communicates the very best of what God has done for them. God has delivered them from people that they had no power over. There was no way they could do this for themselves. And so it's just an incredible story of redemption. And in order for it to happen, it's going to require the power of God. So God reminds Moses of that. And he says, remember, I've shown you a few things already. Throw the staff down, it'll become a snake. Put your hand inside your cloak, it'll be leprous. He then told him, as a matter of fact, you're actually going to be able to strike the Nile River, and it's going to turn blood into blood. Now, for somebody like Moses, who was reared in Egypt, He knew the value of the Nile River. As a matter of fact, many of the Egyptians actually worshiped the Nile. They believed that Nile actually was a god. And as y'all know, the Nile River overflows annually, and it just brings nutrients and enriches and the soil all around it. So when you look at civilization in Egypt, it basically took place along the Nile River because it's a huge arid place, but there was life along the river. And so I'm sure Moses is probably thinking, how in the world will I turn the Nile River into blood? How is that actually going to happen? Obviously, he knows God's going to do it, but that's had to be a huge stretch for somebody like Moses who understood the power and the influence and the impact of the Nile River. But the Lord has basically told him, this is going to happen, and my power is going to be on display. But then you have this little more gnarly conversation, and that has to do with the sovereignty of God. It's one thing to say that God is powerful. It's another thing to say that God is sovereign. And so I want you to notice what this text says. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will not let the people go. That is going to be a part of the story as we get into Moses' relationship with Pharaoh. And it's caused lots of people a lot of consternation. What does it mean when the text says that God will harden the heart of Pharaoh? Well, in the book of Proverbs, the Bible says in Proverbs 21 that the king's heart is like the channel of a river in God's hands. In fact, I read that this morning. And so God has the ability to shape the hearts of human beings. And certainly if he is engaged in a plan that is much larger, and these folks are playing the roles that they're supposed to play, and so God's ultimate power is going to be displayed in Egypt. And in order for that to happen, Pharaoh is going to have to continue to not allow Israel to leave. And so in order for that to occur, his heart is going to continue to be hardened. And that is the demonstration of the sovereignty of God. It causes some theological questions. Obviously, it always has. This story always has for people. For the Jewish theologian, it's not that big a deal because God can just do whatever God wants to do. But for those of us who live in the Western world, when you read something like that, it makes it feel like a violation of the human will. Does that make sense? In other words, if God has created human beings and given them the freedom of choice and the freedom, and he honors that freedom of the will and the freedom of conscience, how does that work? And what I would tell y'all is, my short answer is I don't know. What I've got to do is just read the text and let the text inform me and challenge me in my own understanding of how God works. It just seems to me that in this particular story, in this particular instance, God is going to manifest himself in an unforgettable way in the life of Israel and Egypt that is going to communicate some truths about God that will be set in place from now on. And so the people that are playing their parts in this particular story, I don't necessarily believe that this is normative, if you will, but this is something that God saw as necessary in order for his plan to be accomplished at the level he intended to accomplish it. And so in order for that to occur, in other words, when Moses throws down the staff and he and Aaron and it turns into a snake, that's not going to be enough for Pharaoh. Even turning the river into blood is not going to be enough for Pharaoh. And so this is going to be a comprehensive defeat of the panoply of gods in Egypt. That's what's going to happen when they get there. So God is going to take on basically the pantheon of gods that the Egyptians would have embraced all the way down to Pharaoh himself when the firstborn are slain. And so this is going to be an utter, unforgettable defeat of everything pagan about the Egyptians. And it is going to be an incredible story of redemption and rescue by God. So in order for that to occur on a human stage, some things had to happen. And evidently, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is one of those things. And so while it does still create some theological questions, I think we have to let the authority and the inspiration of the text override some of our hesitations, and that's always hard to do for us. I don't know how you are, but I like to wrestle things to the mat, get it completely resolved so that I can go on. There are some things that I have to hold a little bit loosely, and you're in the arena of that when you start talking about the sovereignty of God. Okay? We'll get back to that, I'm sure, here in a little while. And then notice, God communicates something to Moses about Israel. He refers to Israel as his firstborn. In other words, this is the kind of relationship that God has with Israel. It is a personal relationship. God is viewed as the shepherd of Israel. In this instance, he's referring to himself as the father of Israel. Sometimes he's the groom, if you will, and he has this love for Israel like she's a bride. So all this imagery is found in the Old Testament. But this is a powerful statement of the intimate relationship that God has with these people. These are his people, and they are like his firstborn son. And so he's going to protect them. And that's the message that he wants to deliver to Pharaoh, that Pharaoh will understand that language. People understand familial language, don't they? When you start talking about children, people understand families. Years ago when we first started working in West Africa, we were still in Alabama at the time, and Cindy was in Mali, and she was doing a medical trip, and it was, I think it's about her first or second time to ever be in Africa. And so what happened in that particular culture among the Malinke people are illiterate people for the most part. So the oral traditions for them are incredibly important. And so it's very common for them in the evenings to gather around a fire, and the elders tell the story of their people. And they always have a person called the griot. The griot is kind of the storyteller, is what he was called. And so they were gathered around this huge fire and had all these elders from the village there. And they asked Cindy, tell us one of the stories about Jesus. And so she had a translator, and then the griot, and the chief, and everybody there. So Cindy would tell the story, translator would take it and translate it, the griot would then interpret it, and then the people respond. Does that make sense? So Cindy decides to tell the story of the prodigal son. So she starts off by saying there was a man who had two sons, one older, one younger. So the translator says that, the griot says that, everybody's okay. And then Cindy said, and the younger son decided he wanted what was coming for him right now rather than waiting his turn or something like that. The translator says that, the griot says that, and the chief goes, mm-hmm. In other words, these stories about families communicate across cultural lines, if you will. When Moses is going to communicate to Pharaoh, if you want to know how God views all of us, he views us as his firstborn son. Well, that's going to communicate to Pharaoh because Pharaoh has a firstborn son. And so he's going to be able to connect to this relationally, and it's going to end up being very costly to him, as y'all know. But it just communicates to me a beautiful message about the relationship God has with Israel at this point. Then he also lets Moses know that before this thing's over with, his judgment and his grace are going to be juxtaposed, which in my opinion it always is. It's just how it works with God. God's judgment, when it's on display, it's always laced with his grace. And so on the one hand, the judgment of God is going to fall on Egypt, and the firstborn of the Egyptians will be struck down. But what about the firstborn of the Israelites? They'll be spared. The grace of God will spare them. Remember, they'll put the blood on the doorpost. Remember, we'll get to that story. And the angel of death is going to pass over Israel. And so the grace of God will be on display as well as the judgment of God. And that's all about to unfold in front of them. Okay? Then you come to verse 24 and you have this little, I just call it a strange interlude. Okay? So let me just read it to you. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, touched Moses' feet with it. Surely you're a bridegroom of blood to me, she said. So the Lord let him alone. At that time, she said bridegroom of blood, referring to the circumcision. Obviously, that little text needs no explanation. It just kind of stands on its own, right? Y'all want to just move on? So what in the world So I put in your outline. Here's the challenge that you run into sometimes translating something from one language to another. You have to make decisions. Is what translators do. And first of all, I want to defend the role of translators. Do you know that you and I are incredibly indebted to a group of really, 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 really smart people? There are people who give their time and their energy to, first of all, collecting and poring over the texts that we have to make sure we have the best texts. Okay? So that's one thing. And then secondly, they pore over these ancient languages and try to best understand the language as it's expressed in the text and all the idioms that go with it. And then they try to somehow bring all that to bear when they put it into a language that you are going to be reading. Obviously, a lot of energy and attention has been given particularly to the English translation of the Scripture because the English language has been so predominant in the Western world. So as you might imagine, there's been a lot of energy and attention given to English translations of the Bible. Now, I'm old enough to remember when I was a little boy that at our church that I was reared in, if you were to read anything from the pulpit, from the pulpit that was printed on this thin paper, you better be reading from what? The King James Version. I'm just telling you right now. One of our pastors actually got fired at our church because he had a propensity to preach from the Living Bible. I don't know if y'all remember the Living Bible or not. But anyway, it proved not to be very much alive for him because that was just not what our church was ready for. Well, the King James is an excellent translation of the Greek and Hebrew. That's why it has stood the test of time. In fact, I would tell you it's one of the best translations of the Greek and Hebrew, in my opinion. But what's the problem with the King James? It's the English that it uses that is somewhat lost on us today. True? We just don't speak that way any longer. That doesn't deny the beauty and the value of the King James Version of the Bible because it really is, to me, a beautiful translation of the text. Well, so what's happened in the modern era is that scholars have attempted to try to figure out how to best put the text in the hands of the people. And you have probably about 3 different approaches to doing that. One of them is just be as literal as you can be. Just look at the text and translate it as literally as possible. And that is a philosophy of translation. If you were to be reading from the New American Standard Bible, some of y'all may use that translation, that's the approach of the New American Standard Bible. It works really hard to be as literal as possible, putting the text into English. The challenge that people have with the New American Standard Bible, if I can say it respectfully, is that it's a little bit wooden in its English. And so it has been somewhat limited, to be honest with y'all. It has found its way into the hands of the academic community more than into the general populace. A lot of people use the New American Standard Bible, but nothing like the NIV. There's another philosophy that is more, it's usually referred to as the dynamic equivalent approach, that you take the text, get the best readings of the text, translate it as literally as possible, and then take that literal translation and try to put it in the idiom of the current language that you're translating it into so people can read it and it has a nice flow to it and it seems to be more accessible. That's the NIV. So the NIV is a translation, and it begins with a literal translation of the text. Why I like it. It's a team of scholars that does it for us. But then the attempt then is to put it in the most accessible language for the most amount of people, if I can say it that way. That's one of the reasons the NIV is such a huge bestseller. It's the most popular seller, if you will, in the English language. However, sometimes when you do that, you've got to make inferences and you make decisions. Okay, so here's one of the examples where that's been done. If you'll look at verse 24, here's what the Hebrew text says literally. And it came to pass along the way at the encampment, Yahweh met him and sought to kill him. That's all it says. Now I want you to compare that with the NIV. And again, I'm going to be very respectful of the NIV because it's the Word of God, but there's an inference here. And I want you to notice, if most of you, if you have the NIV, it probably has a footnote. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses. Now look at the literal translation. Came to pass along the way at the encampment, Yahweh met him. Now, in my NIV, I don't know about y'all's, my NIV has a little note. It has an A over Moses' name. And if I go down to the bottom of the page, it says Hebrew him. That's what I love about the NIV. The NIV is telling you that literally it's the word him. We're inferring that this is Moses. Okay? So here's what you need to know. There is scholarly disagreement about who the him is. Is that correct English? Who is the him? Okay? Here's the question. Is the him Moses' son, or is the him Moses? And I would tell you right now, competent Hebrew scholars are divided on this point. In fact, two of my favorite commentaries that I study when I'm studying Exodus have the opposite view. One of them says, obviously, this is Moses. Everybody wants to protect God at this point. Everybody's nervous about it. But if you just read the general reading of the text, God's talking to Moses. Moses is the central character in the story. He's talking about Moses. One of the other scholars that I read says it's obvious. Anybody who's reading this knows this is not Moses. God's just told Moses what he's about to go do. The last thing he's going to do is kill him. So I'm reading these two guys at the same time, wondering, have y'all ever talked to each other? And so the good news is they have, because they each quote each other. In other words, they say, here's a pool of scholars that believe this. Here's what I believe. So here's the question. Who is God about to put to death? Here's what the NIV is saying to you theologically. This is their view. It's the view of their take on this story. Moses is supposed to have already had his boys circumcised because Moses is not a Midianite. Moses is a Jew. He is a son of Abraham. And he knows full well the covenant story of Abraham. Remember, he was taught the story of his heritage by his mother and his sister. You remember this? Moses is not an Egyptian and he is not a Midianite. He is a Jew. And he knows he was circumcised by his parents. And so he knows that this is the covenant sign of all the male children of Israel. And you don't mess with it because this came from God. This didn't come from Abraham. This came from God himself. And God said, this will be my sign. You belong to me. And one of the ways you show that you belong to me is you obey me. And one of the ways you obey me is you bring every male child into the covenant. And the way you bring every male child in the covenant is through the covenant of circumcision. It's a non-negotiable. This is what you will do. And if you don't do it, you will suffer judgment. So the NIV translators are saying, here's Moses, who's supposed to be this deliverer. The guy that's going to be used is God's hand of redemption. And he has disobeyed God and his own family. And God is telling him along the way, I'm going to let you know how serious this is with me. I am putting you right now at the edge of death if you don't obey me at this very crucial point in the life of your own family. Does that make sense? This is the interpreter's view that God is saying to Moses, if you think you can mess with me and still play this role, you can't. If you think you can disobey me and your own family and still do what I'm calling you to do, that's not going to be possible. You're going to have to obey me every step of the way. That's the theological interpretation behind going ahead and putting Moses' name here. Now again, the translator tells you point blank Moses' name is not in here because you got that footnote, okay? Now, here's the other view. The other view is Moses has chosen, for whatever reason, to not circumcise his son. And God is going to show Moses, if you think that I won't take your firstborn, like I'm about to take Abraham's, let me just show you how serious I am. If you're going to disobey me and your own family, I'll go ahead and take your son from you right now. Zipporah sees that and says, I will circumcise this boy. I will intervene because this boy is on the brink of death. And the message is, we should have already done this. Why they hadn't done it, we don't know. Not sure what the communication was. I'm not sure what the tradition was among the Midianites. Remember, Zipporah's, she's Jethro's daughter. She wasn't raised as a Jew, right? So there's a little bit of, I guess, excuse for her. But the point is, she understands how serious this is, and so she goes ahead and circumcises the boy. And the word bridegroom is an interesting word in Hebrew. It just means blood relative. And so if you interpret this being about circumcising the child because of the relationship, because Moses was the one who's about to be killed, she's saying, you're my bridegroom, and obviously the blood of the covenant is on display here. If you interpret it to be her firstborn son, then you would just say he's a blood relative. Does that make sense? Because you can translate that word either way. Because the NIV has chosen Moses, they're going to translate that word bridegroom. If you were to choose the son, you would translate it blood relative. Okay? So which is it? To be honest with y'all, the text doesn't really tell us which it is. It could be either one. And either one of them would be theologically accurate. Because the point is, for whatever reason, at this point in Moses' life, he has chosen not to utilize the sign of the covenant on his own son. So either he's under the threat of death or the son is under the threat of death. Point is, God is saying to Moses, you're on a holy journey with me, and I'm not going to tolerate this kind of disobedience in your own family, whether it's against Moses or against the son. Does that make sense? That's kind of how I see it. And to be honest with y'all, I don't really know. I'm a huge NIV guy. Y'all know that about me. People ask me that all the time. I have some of the students that I taught at Truett who ask me what translation to use. I love the NIV. Occasionally, we'll run up against something like this. And here's what I typically do when I find that. I will just go and consult. I always start with the New American Standard Bible. I always start with the NASB just to see what does it say. How does it translate this text? And then I have to go back to the Hebrew or the Greek. And I've told you before, Greek is more my expertise, not Hebrew. So I have to lean into some scholars to help me. So that's what I did with this text. When you go back and look at it in the Hebrew, Moses' name actually never appears in this story, in the Hebrew text. But if you choose Moses at the beginning, that's why you choose him in the next sentence. Okay? And so I probably lean more toward it being the son than Moses myself, but I understand why the NIV translators would choose Moses. Okay? Now, with that said, then you get to verse 27, and now there's a reunion with Aaron. Now, presumably, Aaron's living in Egypt. He's a Jew, and he's Moses' brother. He's Moses' older brother. So Aaron was born along with Miriam before Pharaoh said, go and kill kill these boys, right? So presumably he's an elder in Egypt, okay? So verse 27, the Lord said to Aaron, go to the wilderness to meet Moses. So he met Moses at the mountain of God and kissed him. And Moses told Aaron everything the Lord had sent him to say, and also about all the signs he had commanded him to perform. So in other words, the alliance now is struck between Moses and Aaron. And these two men are going to be in partnership now for the next 40 years. They're going to lead Israel out of Egypt. They're going to take them towards the promised land. Both of them are going to make mistakes. Right? Both of them. Aaron is going to make the golden calf. Remember that? We'll talk about that later. It's one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament when Moses says what happened. And Aaron says, man, I don't know. We just threw all this gold in here and this calf just came out. I mean, it's crazy. I love brothers' stories. You know how brothers just talk to each other, But remember, Moses is going to disobey God and miss out on the promised land. So these two men, they're humans. They're not perfect, but they're the instruments that God's going to use to deliver Israel in the greatest story of the Old Testament. So I want to give them the respect they're due. So Aaron has heard a word from God. Evidently, Aaron has requested permission temporarily to leave Egypt and go have a conference with his brother. And the powers that be in Egypt have allowed him to do that. We presume that he's one of the elders in Egypt. He would have been known among the leaders there. Okay? And then, verse 29, we get the reunion with the leaders of Israel. So Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders of Israel, of the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. So Moses has shared it with Aaron. Aaron presumably is one of them, so he shares it all with them. He performed the signs before the people. So in other words, threw the staff on the ground, became a snake, put the hand in the cloak, it's leprous, put it back in, take it out. It's clean. The promise of the Nile River. And so, notice verse 31. They believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped. I love this story right here because this to me shows the beginning of this relationship, and this shows Israel at its best, in my opinion. They heard the word from God. They recognized it was from God. They immediately honored it as being from God, and their reaction was just in humility was to bow down and worship their God. I love that. These are people of God, and they've been waiting for years, longing for God to intervene and do something, and God's about to do it, and they're going to rejoice. And they believe in the messenger that God sent them. So the mission is about to begin, when we leave this text. Now, we all know this story, so we know that it's going to be a winding story. It's going to be a challenge, and it's not going to go as Moses would like for it to have gone, I'm sure, or even the people of God. However, God's going to keep His word, and the very things that He says to Moses in that summary in verses 21 through 23, that's all actually going to happen. And we're going to have to read this story to the very end to see it take place and unfold in front of us. But God's going to keep His word, and He's going to use Moses and Aaron to deliver these people. So, all right, I'm going to stop right there. So those of you that are online, thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next week.